You have to think like every idea that you come up with has a shelf life. You can have the most amazing idea that for 15 frames or 30 frames is the greatest thing anyone's ever seen. But does that idea then begin to deteriorate or degrade if it's on screen for 2 seconds or 3 seconds or 4 seconds?
So talk about this mood board that we're looking at. Like, where do you find this reference? How do you know what you want to show the client? How do you explain this to them?
Well, mood boards can kind of be a bit of a double-edged sword. So it is worth noting that you can definitely burn yourself by using mood boards or relying on them too heavily. So usually before I even have a mood board, I have a page kind of explaining the purpose of it. If you have a client that's not in the know and you just show them a bunch of stuff, their first inclination is going to be to think that, oh, what you're going to make is going to look exactly like these things, or it's going to be directly lifted from it. They don't understand the ethics of it sometimes, or what the purpose of this is. So one of the things I always try to explain is that this is just about tone and general language and kind of color. So like this paragraph that I have here, these images do not depict the exact style of our artwork, and it won't be direct recreations of any of these works. Think about it as just general visual language or aesthetics and guiding principles. So you definitely always want to caveat the purpose of the mood board. And for me, what I then went on to discuss with them is just this idea that we have Leonard Cohen, who's this kind of mysterious, kind of dark figure. He's always wearing a suit and that hat. His music has a kind of like somber tone to it, or at least much of it does. And so this set of imagery is just stuff that I collected offline and just kind of was looking for with that in mind, where the general values are on the darker end of the spectrum. It's not super playful, even though you have very playful imagery and some pops of color in there. The colors are definitely more earthy and darker. It's very minimal, lots of graphic kind of forms. Everything's very abstracted. It's not super representational. There's hints of the human hand or various mediums, whether it be pencil lines or cut paper or brush strokes. So it kind of encapsulates this idea that the color palette's going to be darker. It's going to be very minimal. It's going to be very graphic. And there's going to be some stuff that's rough around the edges. It's not going to be perfect silhouettes and perfect vector and things like that. And I think this kind of communicated that quite well as just a starting off point. The mood board is a great opportunity to say, look, I have good taste. Look at these cool images. If we're lucky, the work that we make is going to live in this space as well. And if you can successfully present it that way, it's a really good way to get the conversation going before you then have to start designing actual frames and things like that.
I love it. And I think, for motion designers watching this, that's going to be kind of intuitive. We have the advantage of we've seen the films, and now looking at the mood boards, you can see lots of correlations between some of the ideas. That image in the top left, it reminds me, I think, of a moment from the Cohen piece where there's sort of this fractal zoom with echoes of the silhouette kind of coming at you. So you've got this mood board and sort of this art direction in your head, clearly. So what's the next step? Do you start designing fully fleshed out frames, or do you have some storyboarding process that you do?
I'm definitely a big advocate of storyboarding first, and that's really challenging. So if you think about it from the context of working at a design studio, or an animation studio, I should say, if you only have 2 days for a pitch, you don't really have very much time to storyboard out an entire thing, or maybe there isn't even a script, so what are you even storyboarding to begin with? A lot of people come to it from the school of thought of start with the designs, make something cool and sexy and that people can kind of rally behind, and then build the rest of it around it. I actually come from it from the other perspective. A lot of that is the privilege of the type of work that I do, which is very largely based around like more story and like a specific sequence of events. So for myself, the next step was kind of moving directly into breaking down the script and what those major moments are and what they're going to be. And if you listen to the Cohen VO, which we'll include, it kind of breaks down into these main chunks. And again, another one of the benefits of Google Slides, this isn't an advertisement for Google Slides, but I can just embed the audio directly. And now whoever's here can listen. But the first thing that I did was kind of look at the script and think about like, what are the themes or the chapters of it? And what ended up happening with how I kind of edited the script down is it kind of broke down into these three broad categories. Cohen's state of mind before his death, Cohen's reflection on the topic of death, and then the work that he'll leave behind. So this was a really good thing to wrap my head around of like the tone, how the piece will build, and also how music will play a role in this. And so all of this thinking is done before any style frames have been done, before any storyboards or anything like that have been created. One of the things that you definitely have to do, and we'll kind of get into the storyboards next, which we have here, you really have to break down what the script is and what its intent. And most importantly, you have to think about it almost in a percussive sense about what your beats are and what like actions are. So if you type up the Leonard Cohen script in just the normal way that you would type a paper or the normal way that we just like write, it would look something like this. But the way that these words are placed varies very differently than the actual delivery of hearing Leonard Cohen, an elderly man, really laboring over these words. So, you know, you can read this as, in a certain sense, this particular predicament is filled with many less distractions. That's vastly different than the way and the intent that Cohen is speaking. And so one of the very first things I like to do, and I'll actually pick up my sketchbook soon, is I try to look at the script, what the intent is, but then also the beats or the rhythm of it. So in this example, this is actually all wrong. It's actually, in a certain sense, pause. This particular predicament, pause, is filled with pause, many less pause, distractions, end statement. So that is that's almost like multiple scenes or multiple beats that you have to consider, as opposed to just one sentence that comes out very quickly, like you would say in a conversational way with your friends. And those are things you really have to think about and weigh when you're beginning storyboarding. So one of the things that I like to do is when I'm storyboarding, and we'll open some of the files up later, is I try to be as specific as I can. And this was just an export from Photoshop, but using this as an example, you can see that the VO hasn't even come in yet. One of the ideas that I started this with is setting the tone by having Cohen being in like a venue or playing music to kind of set the stage for the story. But you can see that as I go through, every single beat of that delivery of the voiceover, we can see that the camera is beginning to move. So we start in black. Maybe there's some hints of light or reflection kind of on this mysterious silhouette, and then the spotlight kind of pops on and fills the frame. And then when we hear the beginning of the line, in a certain sense, that's when the camera begins to move. And then it goes into this particular predicament is filled with many less distractions. This, even though it's multiple beats, we kind of pan across all of these different distractions. So it's kind of entering this kind of, I guess, slightly like surreal or abstract kind of sequence where we're visualizing in a kind of graphic way many of the different things that may have distracted Cohen in his life previously. The intent of this is saying it's filled with many less of these. So as the camera is kind of dollying across, we then clear the frame and it just ends up with the pen or what he's using to work. And that's when it goes into, it actually enables me to work with a little more concentration. So we kind of start in this venue kind of vibe to introduce the story and the tone. We then go through this kind of sequence of distractions where we're kind of filling the frame with all of this stuff that we're going to see. And then we're ultimately wiping the frame away to something much more minimal or much more focused, which is the ability to work, which is being represented by the pen. And if I'm really honest, like I actually probably should have storyboarded this much more. And we haven't even gone into the quality of these storyboards, which is really, really bad. But, you know, like in a lot of senses, even though I'm breaking this down into all these different beats, Normally, if I were doing this, say like the buck approach, there would be like in-betweens between almost every single one of these as well, so that your animatic can be much more fleshed out. But I like to spend a lot of time with the story very early on and really figure out exactly what this thing is going to be, or what I hope for it to be, from day like one almost. And then what you'll see is when we go into the designs, you're gonna notice that these are all very eerily similar to what the final designs are. I like to think about composition and like value and all of those things, because then it makes the process of actually designing it all much, much easier if this is my starting off point. If this decision informs all of the subsequent decisions as well.
So this is actually really interesting for me, Joe, to see your storyboard process here and sort of how lo-fi the renderings are of them. And, you know, the first several are just black and white. They're two colors. My question, though, is how do you come up with these ideas? So, I mean, the example that you gave of, you know, there's less distractions at the end of his life. And you have this visual metaphor of all of these distractions. And there was like, you know, a crucifix, and there was like a razor blade and a pile of cocaine. And then they go away, and then it's the pen, because the pen represents, you know, he's a writer, he's a poet, and a musician. Where does that come from? And how do you decide, you know, because there were other moments that are way more literal, you know, but that was a very abstract visual metaphor moment. So how do you think about balancing really abstract moments versus more sort of concrete, like I'm gonna draw him walking because he's talking about walking or something like that?
Well, that's definitely a challenging one, and it's something that is always done on a case-by-case basis between every project and every script and every individual. If you're doing something like this that showcases somebody, is always going to be different. So a lot of it is about like looking at where it comes in the story and how that segues from one thing to the other. It's not something that you just know like, oh, shot 3 is going to be cool and abstract, and then shot 5 is going to be literal. You kind of have to start somewhere and then continually build and like refining it and refining it as you go. And I'm usually a pretty big fan of mixing the two together. So like, you know, just as the example, like I can actually just go down to some of the style frames. When we start, we're starting in like a very literal space, even though it's still very minimal. It's presumably Cohen from behind, playing on a stage. And then that immediately segues into these distractions, which is from a different camera angle, the scale is different, the perspectives are different, all of that stuff changes kind of rapidly. Really, that's one of my favorite aspects of animation, is the fact that we can kind of combine all of these things and kind of seamlessly jump from one to the other. As I was kind of going through it, it's like, there's no one size fits all approach of knowing like, oh, it's been too many abstract ideas, now I have to like nail it with a literal one. It's really just about weighing what you hope to achieve with the project is and how you can represent it. A lot of times there's this, I guess I would say, a misconception that anything literal is bad, that everything has to be like abstract and kind of these crazy metaphors and things like that. And to some degree that's true. You can see certain pieces where it's just completely visual metaphor and abstraction the whole time. But I always like to have something that kind of roots it, where like every so often, like having that literal moment where we kind of enter back into reality as Cohen is picking up the pen to then segue back into the abstract or the kind of like the fantastic. To me, that kind of makes it more rich, and it provides this like ebb and flow throughout the piece. And it's something that, you know, is done constantly, because we go from him being represented by talking about the state of his body and feeling kind of restricted or confined by or limited by his health, being represented as him being in jail, which he obviously isn't. But that then segues directly into a much more normal depiction of, you know, him sitting at a chair and just having like a brief moment that would almost be what you would expect from the interview, where he's just reflecting and talking. So we kind of go from, constantly are going from what would be presumably the real world and like moments like this to these moments of not necessarily abstraction, but like kind of metaphor and just dealing with the topics in a very different way that isn't rooted in reality as much.
Were there any moments while you were doing this process, and you know, in a moment we'll get more into the actual look and the design of these things, but while you're storyboarding, were there any moments where they were especially difficult to come up with a visual, or maybe also where you come up with something and then you're thinking, oh crap, I have to animate this later?
Yeah, there were definitely many moments in this where I was a little freaked out. I will always be the first to admit my own limitations as a designer and animator. And I try with every project to always put scenes in there, especially during this phase, that kind of scare you and you don't know how the hell you're going to do it. So I think kind of going through it, like when I was looking at, if we just go through these boards, it's like, okay, all this is pretty all right. You know, we got a torsoed character animation. I'm sure I can nail that. Okay, a camera move over top of cool objects. Okay, I can kind of nail that. Hand picking up a pen. Okay, that's going to be kind of harder, but then that's a brief moment. Hand taking off the hat. Okay, that might be a little bit harder as well. This one will be easy. But then as we're getting into this area, like smoke and effects animation is, I've never successfully done smoke animation ever on anything. And so I definitely remember when I kind of created this scene where we're just seeing kind of Cohen reflecting and smoking. I was definitely like, okay, this is gonna suck. Like I have no idea how to animate smoke in this way. And then that went directly into, oh shit, now I have a full-bodied character that's gonna need to be reacting to this like, his inner voice kind of attacking him or yelling at him. All right, shit, that one's gonna be really hard too. Then that goes into, okay, like a hat falling. This one's kind of easy. This leg might be kind of weird. I do want to go into the foot moment because it was a big learning lesson there. And then, okay, maybe easy, I don't know. And then it's like, oh, fuck, a hummingbird. I've never animated a hummingbird before. I'm not a character animator. What the hell am I gonna do about a hummingbird? But he's literally talking about listen to the hummingbird. So I weigh the option of, do I just abstract it or just only show the wings or croppings? But this ended up being the direction I wanted to take. And then the end, like a character walk off. Okay, maybe a little easier. But like there was definitely a few of these that I was terrified by, and were definitely learning experiences for sure.
So that's awesome, Joe. Thank you for walking through that. And, you know, you pointed out that there was a learning experience with that foot shot, you know, where the hat falls and then sort of the foot falls through the frame. What was the learning experience?
So when this shot happens...
Took care of business and I'm ready to die. I hope it isn't uncomfortable.
Maybe I'm being a little bit overly critical, but I was really... You want to think about... The decisions that you make when you're storyboarding or what you're coming up with, they have to satisfy a lot of different kind of categories. If you think about it like a Venn diagram, you want something that aligns in the middle. You have the story that's being told and how you're representing it, how you design it, and then you have how you animate it and the timing of the scene. And in a perfect world, you want that all to like overlap and be right in the middle. And this is an instance where if we think about those three pillars that kind of like would make a good idea or a good scene, I think representing Cohen as his hat, I think that was smart. I really liked it. You know, he always wears his hat. I think after he passed away, it went on to be sold for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So when he starts talking about, I'm ready to die, we see the hat just fall and it just, like, there's no more Cohen anymore. Like, he's gone. The hat's on the ground. And then when he says, I hope it isn't uncomfortable, we then see the hat get crushed. So we're representing Cohen in the hat, and then we're now showing it being crushed and like his kind of showing his insecurity about maybe pain or what happens with death. And then that transitions to the next scene with the heel. So at storyboard level, only looking at the ideas, it's like check, check, check. I think this is a good idea. But this is where timing comes in, and your ideas not only have to work for how you're representing the concept, how it looks, and how it moves, and your abilities, but timing is that crucial point you have to think about. Because if I'm really honest, if I watch this scene, if I were to play it in like 2 times speed, where the foot comes in, it steps and then rolls through and then immediately segues, it would have been amazing and I'd have been really happy. But based on the delivery and the timing of Cohen as he delivers this, the foot comes in, it steps, And then we just sit here for an eternity. And this is not a pretty frame. And so this is where, even though on the surface is like conceptually, design-wise, animation-wise, I was able to pull off the movements, all of those things are a check. The thing that I neglected to consider or should have considered with more importance is time. And this frame, this in-between, doesn't have the weight or the merit to stay on screen for as long as it does, because we just sit here for like an eternity. It's like 20 frames of just this. And you have to think like every idea that you come up with has a shelf life. You can have the most amazing idea that for 15 frames or 30 frames is the greatest thing anyone's ever seen. But does that idea then begin to deteriorate or degrade if it's on screen for 2 seconds or 3 seconds or 4 seconds? So the merit of your idea and how successful they are has a shelf life. And this is one where, you know, after battling with it and doing all this, I probably should have started over or found a better solution. I just ended up letting the foot just stay for an eternity on this. And in hindsight, the shelf life of that initial idea wasn't good enough for the amount of real estate or the amount of time that it takes up in the timeline. And that was definitely a huge learning curve, because this is like my least favorite shot, which is funny because I had many people I think be like, oh, I love that transition into the heel of the shoe. And for me, it's always like sullied because I'm like, oh, but we stop on the shoe for too long and the shoe sucks. No. So that was definitely a learning experience for sure.
That's great. And, you know, it makes me think that, like, in my head, that's the kind of thing that hopefully an animatic can kind of catch before you go too far with it. But obviously, like, that doesn't always work. And so it's interesting to see the tension between the way ideas look when they're, you know, on like a 6-up storyboard like we're looking at here versus when it's actually moving and there's music and voiceover. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the animatic process, and maybe we could even look at the animatic for this. How important is that process? Because you have a very detailed storyboard here. And sometimes, you know, in my experience, I found clients can get confused by animatics if they're not savvy. So maybe, Joe, we could just take a look at the animatic and you could talk a little bit about sort of what that process was like for this.
Yeah, so again, I'm a very big proponent of storyboarding early on and putting that animatic together very, very early on. That doesn't work for all projects. Obviously, if you're doing something for a tech company and it's just based on spectacle and wow factor, sometimes that stuff can't be storyboarded if you're doing some crazy particular or Houdini simulation. But for anything that's very conceptual, I always vote for, or I'm a very big proponent of, starting simple and chiseling away at it. One of the examples that I like to use is there's kind of like two sayings or two ways to thinking about it. In the development process, I like to think about it as like a juggler. And if you think about it, in the development process, your goal is to make it so you're juggling as little as possible once you get to production. And so if you're juggling the timeline, the budget, what the designs are going to be, what the animations are going to be, what the concepts are going to be, you want to ideally get as few of those things solved and figured out before you go into After Effects, before you even open After Effects the first time. Because if not, what's going to happen is you're going to be going into production and you're not going to be able to have this blueprint that you can build upon. And you're going to be going, oh, well, what is this scene going to be? And you're literally just juggling a bunch of things that you shouldn't be juggling at that time. And it leaves a lot of question marks. Like, so if you think about it almost as like a board game or a sequence of question marks, before you enter production or before you touch After Effects or 3D or whatever, it's like answer as many of those as you can in advance. And the animatic is a really big part of that, because what I like to say is if you can make it work in its ugliest form, you already know it's successful. And that's the case with any project. If it weren't for NDAs, I could show you some of the ugliest animatics imaginable that were sent to the likes of Google and Apple and all of these tech companies with budgets and projects that are well into the 6 figures. I should preface that you always want to make your storyboards and animatics as polished as you can, but there is a certain aspect where if you can make it work and can get people behind the idea when it's ugly, then your work is halfway done for you. And so I can pull up the animatic and we can actually watch it, because boy, is it ugly.
In a certain sense, this particular predicament is filled with many less distractions than at other periods of my life, and actually enables me to work with a little more concentration and continuity. The only thing that mitigates against full production is just the condition of my body, because there are times I just have to lie down. Sometimes it's just like, you're losing too much weight now, man. You're dying, but you don't have to cooperate so enthusiastically with the process. It's very compassionate at this stage. I mean, more than at any time in my life. I don't have that voice that says, "You're f***ing up." That's a tremendous blessing. Really, you know, I'm ready to die. I hope it isn't uncomfortable. There's a great deal of new material that I haven't sorted out. There are songs halfway through that are not bad. Listen to the hummingbird, whose wings you cannot see. Listen to the hummingbird, don't listen to me. Listen to the mind of God, which doesn't need to be. Listen to the mind of God, don't listen to me. It's halfway. I don't think I'll be able to finish those songs. And maybe I'll get a second wind, I don't know.
So great, dude. So it was really cool to see the animatic because, you know, having seen the final piece, I was actually struck by how close to the final piece these storyboards are. I mean, you know, obviously the style of the art changed a little bit, but I mean, even the general form of things was pretty close. I mean, is this where you started? Was there some rougher version of this that we haven't seen?
Yeah, so I definitely work very close to what the final will be from a pretty early stage. I will definitely go through rounds and iterations, but I think at this stage, maybe this is something that comes just with like more than a decade of doing it. I don't know if it's confidence or what, but I'll be able to start something and kind of in my gut know what I want it to be earlier on than in the past. So like with this one specifically, it just kind of clicked and I just kind of knew where I wanted to go with it. But going back to like, you know, the original script, how I kind of showed you if we go here and how I like broke it up to individual lines, what I actually did is I wrote this all down and I just numbered it like 1, 2, 3, 4. And one thing that I've done, and I've actually done this ever since my very first like directorial debut, I'm gonna put that in air quotes here. My very first film I directed and was like a really big one for me was the one I did for the New York Times back in 2013. And I was living in Brooklyn and I went to Muji, which is like a cool Japanese store. And I bought this notebook. I'm gonna try to like see if the camera will focus on it. All it is what is very close to 16:9 rectangles. All back to back. So it's literally perfect for storyboarding. And I've had these since 2013. And most of my big projects I've done, I've actually done in this book. And what I'll end up doing is something that's kind of called a blind gesture. For anyone who's taken a still life or any fundamental, like arts fundamental courses, one of the things you're doing when you're learning about doing still lifes or figure drawings is you'll do a blind gesture. And you'll have your big sheet of Reeves BFK paper over here on your right, and you'll have your charcoal in your hand, but you don't look at it. You look at the still life or the model, and you don't look at the paper, and you just draw. Like you kind of find the bounds, the extremes of the page, and you just start making marks without looking and trying to encapsulate the energy or the form of the subject. And so I will actually do that in this book where I'll just be listening to the voiceover or I will be looking at the lines and I'm just making like what are the ugliest drawings imaginable. Let's see if I can get it to focus. The ugliest like that's supposed to be a hand holding a cigarette. This is a little baby Cohen, like on the ground standing there. This is supposed to be like him with his legs crossed, and I think they're all wrong and messed up. And I will actually like just go through and like you can see even the stomp idea is kind of worked out like really early on. You can see we go from the hat to the hat falling into like that transition. And I'll just sit there just with like a pen. You don't want something with an eraser because you don't want to be precious. And I just scribble and make like horrible drawings. Like this should be the thumbnail. Like this one right here where my finger is supposed to be Cohen sitting on the couch with the guitar. That drawing is garbage. But like I just start and I work through the ideas and you'll see that like I number them and I'll cross things out that aren't working. And I just constantly kind of iterate and do that. So I usually start with this as like my guide. And then that's when I shift over into Photoshop and I do a slightly less ugly version. It's like 10% less ugly in Photoshop, and then slowly kind of build and refine that idea. And that's something we'll probably talk about when we talk about process a little bit as well later on.
Yeah, those are really great. I think it's gonna be great, for everyone watching this to see how lo-fi those initial thumbnails are. So the last thing I want to ask you about on this sort of initial phase of this project is related to the animatic, and that's music. And I guess also sort of the timing of Cohen's delivery. So maybe you could just talk about both. So why don't we start with music? I mean, who picked the music? Was that you? Was it stock music? How did that process work?
So this is a perfect opportunity to sing the praise of Ambrose Yu to eternity and how he saved this project. Originally, I was involved with like cutting up the script and kind of doing that. And I tried to preserve all of like the Leonard Cohen's inflection and his pauses like in statements, but I definitely condensed where I could. But we couldn't actually use any of Leonard Cohen's wonderful music for the tribute piece on Leonard Cohen. And so in the beginning, it was just stock music, and I found some options. Some of the staff members at the New Yorker found some options. And we actually finished the film with stock music and like very little attention to detail or very little budget or time spent on music. After the film was completed, I actually, without the New Yorker's permission, I hired Ambrose and paid him with my own money because I wasn't happy with where it ended up and I knew it could be much better. But I ended up paying him out of my own pocket to redo the music for what, like, I guess the director's cut would be. And what's funny is after I paid Ambrose out of my own pocket, I then took that example back to the New Yorker and I kind of like spun it and I was like, oh, my buddy who does sound design just wanted to try it out and see what he could do. And they liked the version with Ambrose's music so much, like that was the catalyst for finding more budget for him to then come on and do all of the music for and sound design for David Attenborough and Janelle Monáe, which was a lifesaver. Because especially with this one, this was a really, really hard piece to get the tone right. And as you can imagine, chopping up stock music to get the tone right for this is very hard. And it was a night and day. So like Ambrose completely saved this project and made it so much better than it would have been had it not been for his efforts and his work.